When talking about ancient Rome, we mostly think of the city's historical buildings, institutions, and emperors. Rightfully so, the imperial metropolis was the largest city in the ancient world, supposedly reaching a population of 1 million people. But the Roman Empire stretched far, far beyond the city's borders and covered a diverse spectrum of peoples and regions, from British Isles to Egypt and from Gibraltar to the Caucasus. All roads lead to Rome, but many would never actually see the great city, yet alone the ruler. The closest most would get would be by staring at the emperor's profile on one of many coins circulating the empire. Professor Mary Beard poses in her book SPQR, History of Ancient Rome, the following questions. How far is it useful to see Roman history in terms of imperial biographies or to divide the story of the empire into emperor-sized chunks or dynasty-sized chunks? How accurate are the standard images of these rulers that have come down to us? What exactly did the emperor's character explain? How much difference and to whom did the qualities of the man on the throne make? So in this video we will step back from the city of Rome, its famous and infamous rulers, and look at how its people lived in the outskirts of Italy and its provinces. Those who had their own culture and customs before being integrated, be it by force or diplomacy, into what would become a grand mosaic of colorful pieces that was the Roman Empire. The focus of our story will be area northeast of the Apennine Peninsula, where the 10th region of Italy, Venetia and Istria, would meet the provinces of Noricum and Illyricum, the last of which would then be split between Pannonia and Dalmatia. Besides being a border region of these administrative zones, the area is also a crossroad of multiple geographical regions, giving it an essential strategic value. Throughout centuries, the peoples living here would have different attitudes towards the Roman state, but all would eventually become part of it. Our journey begins in the ancient city of Aquileia. What is today only a small town was in the ancient times a bustling emporium and one of the most important cities in the entire empire. It was built already in 181 BC as a countermeasure to an invading Celtic tribe, most probably Tauriski, who wanted to settle there but were pushed off by the Roman army, who claimed this territory for the Republic. Since then, the city served as a bulwark against the enemies that would cross into Italy and as a trade hub for those friendly or pragmatic enough to do business. Slaves, cattle, and hides from Celtic lands were exchanged for wine, olive oil, and seafood. Baltic amber also traveled through here and then further down the Adriatic Sea or Apennine Peninsula. While Julius Caesar waged war in Gaul, he and his legions wintered in and around Aquileia, which also served as a springboard for Roman armies marching eastward against Illyrians, Celts, and other so-called barbarians. Though the surrounding territory would be conquered slower than the massive gains Romans acquired in the west through large-scale wars, Aquileia would serve as an administrative center for the nearby territory, which would become under Emperor Augustus the aforementioned Region 10 of Italy. The area along the Amber Road was also the one that was Romanized the quickest and subsequently conquered by Romans the earliest. Their military incursions and influence stretched throughout strategically important Okara Pass and now Portus River. Through these two locations, the Romans controlled access from Italy to the Balkans along the Sava and then Danube River, as well as the Pannonian Basin and the lands beyond. Here the Romans met different Celtic and Illyrian tribes, some of which showed hostile tendencies like Tauriski, while others, like the Kingdom of Noricum, embraced Roman friendship and cooperated with them. The Romans used a clever combination of their military might, policy-making, as well as trade, diplomacy, and potential prosperity as means of integration into Roman culture and state. Most of this territory came under Roman rule during the Illyrian Wars between 35 and 33 BC and concluded with the Pannonian Dalmatian uprising during the 6th and 9 AD, so almost 200 years after the rise of Aquileia. The Romans had a lot to offer to neighboring peoples. Besides rich gifts, new technologies, and privileges for local elites, the beginning of the Roman period marks in many regions of temperate Europe the end of prehistory, meaning that for the first time a widespread writing system and records have been established under the Romans. The Romans built roads, bridges, and cities, and a sophisticated state apparatus of administrative and civil structures. While this region hosted a number of settlements and infrastructure, 4 of them deserve a special mention. Colonia Iulia Emona, Municipium Claudium Selea, Municipium Flavium Latobicorum Neviodonum, and Colonia Ulpia Traiana Poetovia. The last one hosting tens of thousands inhabitants at its peak, more than contemporary Londinium and Vindobona, was one of the most prominent cities between Adriatic coast and the Danube frontier, and was one of the centers of the province of Pannonia. And while they didn't reach the size of larger cities elsewhere in the empire, they were still very important for the development of the surrounding area and its population. Many of these settlements were built on or nearby already established settlements of Celts and other peoples. The people who didn't live in the cities maintained their agrarian lifestyle, and those that were living in the ancient hill forts, or even when the Romans arrived, moved into the valleys below. The buildings maintained a prehistoric architecture, but later even more remote areas had houses with typical Roman elements, like the central atrium and suetrum, indicating a high living standard. Romans also introduced rooftops built with ceramic tiles. The old way of life was preserved at least in some elements, especially outside cities, like ritually destroying and placing weapons into graves, albeit the weapons were now forged in Roman designs. These, along with other gradual adoption of customs, suggest a relatively peaceful transition from the old tribal way of life to the Roman state system. In a Roman house lived the family, servants with their families, and slaves. The head of the family was patronus or pater familias, who publicly represented the house and dealt with matters of family business. The wife, matrona familias, exercised control over activities in the house, organized work, and cared for the welfare of the house's inhabitants. Social status was displayed by one's attire. While formal clothes were white, others came in many shapes and colors and could be made from wool, linen, or silk. Slaves and less wealthy people only wore tunics. Men also wore togas, and men in high positions would have them decorated with white stripes and borders. Conferring of toga also marked the rite of passage from boyhood to manhood. Women wore a lower tunic and a longer upper tunic that extended to their feet, and a mantle. Jewelry also indicated status, like rings, necklaces, and earrings, as well as clasps and buckles. Styles of hair and attire changed with time and among regions, and different provincial fashion took place as a result of harmonious coexistence between natives and new settlers. It is no secret that this land was often confiscated from the indigenous peoples and given to the Roman military veterans, merchants, and craftsmen that settled here. It was also the inclusion of indigenous people into the Roman army that partook in the Romanization of newly acquired territories and people. In some towns, the immigrants from Italy were prevalent in the local government, while others were led by Romanized local elites. Both willingly and unwillingly, the Roman way of life became the standard in the new territory. This and the accelerated building of roads and settlements was enabled by the relative peace, economic growth, and prosperity of the region since the full conquest under Emperor Augustus in the 1st century AD. Romanization was not entirely a passive or spontaneous process. Rather, the Romans knew what they were doing. By offering a carrot and a stick, they could more easily govern vast territories and populations of the expanding empire. Historian Titus would once remark, "They called it, in their ignorance, civilization, but it was really part of their enslavement." What the local populace really thought of this transition remains a mystery. But between the large-scale rebellions, as well as different honors bestowed upon local elites and Roman names written on early tombstones of natives, we can only assume that the opinion of Rome varied heavily and was also dependent on the current conditions and prosperity of the state and the surrounding locale. In some provinces and its towns, like Noricum and Celea respectively, a case of self-Romanization could be observed. The people were proud to adopt civilized Roman ways. Pragmatic businessmen that many of them were, they welcomed improved lifestyles and a booming economy, especially since the alternative would be a violent subjugation. The people, while allowed and determined to keep some local traditions and local governance, were in majority open to Roman nuances. During this time, the empire was becoming a more and more unified economic area with a growing market and a standardized production to fill its needs. The cheapest transport was by sea, followed by rivers, and road transport as the most expensive. It was the roads that played the integral part of the famous postal network in the Roman Empire, enabling swift communication between provinces and with the Italian mainland. Whenever possible, Romans took into consideration the already existing pathways. Along the carefully planned and maintained road network sprang stone milestones that also acted as small monuments to rulers in power during a road's construction or rebuilding. Postal stations were also built approximately 6 to 12 Roman miles from each other. These provided shelter, food, change of horse, and even baths. Roads were also one of the main means of quickly deploying the army to the distant battlefields. They also provided some level of security, especially in the more remote areas in wildlands, where robbers lurked and waited for merchants and other travelers. Taverns with shops could also be found along roads. Here, food and wine were cheap, and guests of all sorts, soldiers, merchants, and officials, passed the time with table games, news, and gossip. Smaller roads branched out from the main ones and were maintained by the local communities. These roads would gain importance in later years of the empire during the civil wars and barbaric incursions. Rivers and waterways provided a cheaper and more convenient way to travel and especially to move larger quantities of cargo. Besides becoming masters of the Mediterranean, the Romans also used rivers as effective water roads to supply settlements and armies further inland. Those living near rivers and those that made their living from it often worshipped not just well-known Roman deities related to water like Neptune, but also those connected with individual rivers, which were often equated with divinities throughout antiquity, with an early example already present in the Homer's Iliad. Trade was well organized within the Roman state. There were wholesalers, retailers, and even commercial agents traveling, selling, and advertising goods. Oxen were used most commonly to drag carts of cargo, as they could pull more than horses. Trade with lands and peoples beyond the empire's borders was also increasing. Amber continued to flow from the Baltic lands, while precious stones and spices came from India and Sri Lanka, while silk came from China through a vast network of intermediaries. The Roman army, a large source of consumption, could also be used as production powerhouse, especially in peacetime, with brickworks being just one example. The society was separated between slaves and the free people, but even among each class, vast differences could be observed. Roman citizenship was a special honor that was bequeathed for loyal service, be it in the army or otherwise, or to local elites of friendly newly integrated peoples. They would take over Romanized versions of their names to better fit the new way of life, but some would still maintain elements of their ancestral culture. Below them were freedmen who could still become very rich and successful craftsmen, merchants, or officials, though they most often remained loyal to their former masters, patrons. This connection between a patron and a client was one of the key relationships in the Roman society. Both parties had obligations to the other. The patron was the benefactor that sponsored and protected his client in exchange for the services. These were most often not exclusive relationships, so one could end up being both a patron and a client to different people. This in turn created a strong but complex network of social ties. At the top of the Roman society were the class of senators and knights, as well as the members of the city council. Slavery was prominent before, during, and even after the Roman era. Most were pushed into their new role after becoming prisoners of war and could be employed in various fields like mining, building, or even more sophisticated crafts like poetry, medicine, and administration. While many were suffering hard conditions, some masters formed a close tie with them and would even free them. Not all slaves were privately owned though, but would be property of communities, cities, or the state. It is interesting that between free peoples and slaves, one could observe a comparable amount of literate and educated people. The freeing of slaves was a relatively regular occurrence, and the freedmen could reach high positions as clergy and officials, though their position was still difficult and was most often still tied to their former masters, now patrons. Physicians, high school teachers, and philosophers were mostly slaves or freed slaves authorized by the state or a province. Medicine, especially surgery, was particularly important in the military. Private schools were established at first, but were later used as an inspiration for state-run public schools, especially in the provinces. Not just different classes of people, but people of very diverse origins could be found across the empire. As such, it wasn't uncommon to find in one place Italic peoples living along with Celts, Illyrians, merchants from eastern and western provinces, official Greek slaves, and so on, all considered Roman on some level. This prosperous era was interrupted by the Marcomannic Wars, when Germanic and Sarmatian peoples crossed the Roman frontier and even marched into Italy. As such, this territory would continue to be the victim of military marches, both of foreign and Roman origin, as civil wars could continue to plague the empire. Cities were the base element of the Roman state, its organization, administration, and all of the state's functions. At the center of a Roman city was a forum, the main square. This was a place for commercial activities, events, and making proclamations. Here also stood the main temple of a city and a basilica that housed local and imperial administration. An array of other buildings provided both vital and luxury services like baths, water mains, central heating, theater, and stadium. A special status a city could achieve was that of a colony. These included the city proper and its surrounding territory and were built with a prepared plan in mind, usually with a grid pattern. This was at first a consequence of a colony's previous function as a military outpost, through which the nearby territory could be controlled while still accelerating commercial activities. The construction and establishment of colonies was determined by the Senate and the people of Rome, which authorized one or multiple people to plan and build a city and distribute land to its colonists. Before the construction, an augur observed the flight of birds to determine the best location and time for works to proceed. They attached a plow to a pair of oxen to till the ground where a future wall and the city limit would be built. This was known as the first or original furrow. Later, colonies were built to house Roman citizens that migrated from Italy into newly conquered lands and afterwards to settle retired soldiers who were offered plots of land. Eventually, the construction of such colonies would stop, but the title would still be used by emperors to designate existing cities with a sign of honor. Colonies were run by town council, established on the model of the Roman Senate. From these councils were elected 2 mayors, 2 high officials, 2 financial officials, and supervisors. One person could also hold other titles and designations. In Poetovio, a member of Valerius' family was also a town architect, a vice-regent of treasury, and the manager of the city finances. Unlike colonies, which were meant and dominated for Roman and Romanized immigrants, the term municipium at first meant, in practical terms, a settlement where an indigenous population was prevalent compared to immigrants from, for example, Italy. Later, though, such designations would change or even lose their meaning, only describing a level of local government. Another member of Valerius' family, Marcus Valerius Maximianus, was one of the most prominent figures that came from this provincial juncture. Originally from Poetovio, he proved himself in the Marcomannic Wars under Emperor Marcus Aurelius. During the war, he led his army, the 2nd Legion, beyond the Danube frontier into the land of Quadi and established a military camp Logarecio, about 100 kilometers in from the Roman border. Marcus was tasked to examine the possibility of subjugating the territory and extending the Roman border. The dream, however, would end with the death of Marcus Aurelius, and never again would the Roman army march so far into the barbaric Europe. As it was usual, the Roman high commanders led their men on the field, as exposed to death as their men, and Marcus was no different in this case. Some years prior, he himself killed Valaon, a commander of the Quadi neighbors Naristi. To kill an enemy leader was an act that was especially respected in the Roman military and nobility. During his career, he even befriended and worked closely with the future emperor Pertinax. Under Marcus Aurelius, Maximianus was decorated and promoted multiple times for his services, during which he also led a legion consisting of defeated Marcomanni, Quadit, and Aristi into distant Syria, where he crushed a rebellion that attempted to rise their own pretender to the imperial throne. He commanded 5 consecutive legions, the last being the 3rd Legion Augusta, with which he also managed North Africa. This position was one of the most prestigious and well-paid, and he was often celebrated in the African province. There, he also left his own mark and that of his birthland by constructing an altar to Jupiter the Pulsar, who was worshipped almost exclusively in the provinces of Noricum and Pannonia. Another famous commander from the surrounding area was Titus Varius Clemens. He was alive during the same time as Marcus Valerius Maximianus, also to a noble family and in the same manner brought up with general and military education. His career led from military functions of an officer and military commander to administrative roles of a procurator, a provincial financial officer. Later he managed the provinces of Mauretania and Raetia. At the peak of his career, he was head secretary of Emperors Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, in charge of the royal correspondence. While he has already proven himself as a dependable administrator and a capable warrior before, this position demonstrates that he was greatly trusted by the emperors. His exact role in the time of Marcomannic Wars hasn't been yet discovered, though he is presumed to be one of the main proponents of establishing a military camp near Savinia River and the designation of the military zone that would enhance defense against invading Germanic tribes. Titus is once again mentioned after the war as a member of the Concilium Princeps, the Council of Imperial Advisors who controlled imperial legislation and the bills sent to the Senate. and like Marcus Maximianus, he also achieved the senatorial rank of the Roman society. But unlike these two great commanders, not all soldiers managed to return home, and many found a new one far away from their birthlands. Their tombstones would be set by their comrades and brothers in arms, who would maintain a close relation even after serving term in the military. They would exchange letters during and after their service. While most clues about the way of life in the times of ancient Rome can be found in cities and thus we can discuss it at greater length, it is important to note that life wasn't limited to the cities. Actually, many regions were relatively densely populated outside of urban settlements, consisting of villages, hamlets, individual farms, and villae rusticae. This, however, would not play as an important part in history as cities or military camps and fortifications. Large towns were also centers of the surrounding territory, organized into administrative units called ager, into which the nearby towns were also included. These hinterlands became the city's economic backbone. In the plains and lowlands suitable for farming, large estates were formed that contained villas with residential and production buildings. Villae rusticae also appeared across the countryside, large estates managed by Italian immigrants, veterans, and Romanized native elite. The Romans utilized their superior use of stone. This wasn't limited only to construction, but spread to decoration, production, and votive offerings. They most often used local sources, though material for individual monuments could be imported from far lands. One of the most valued materials was marble, which had a special property of allowing creation of smooth surfaces on which paint could be applied without any special preparations, aside from covering the surface with a thin layer of white stucco. Besides marble, the Romans began using bricks and tiles of burnt clay, mortar, and concrete. Buildings could have heated floors and walls, and their interiors decorated with frescoes, stucco, and mosaics. Cities were also connected with a water supply and covered with a sewage system. New customs and goods spread quickly among the newly established cities. This is especially true when it comes to cuisine, personal items and care, adornments, housing, furnishing, and leisure. Such items were at first imported from Italy or brought along with Roman immigrants, but were later adopted and adapted by the locals and made in local workshops. The ceramic production flourished because of vast clay deposits, pre-Roman pottery tradition, quality and quantity of firewood, vast local markets, and potential for wider distribution. The most used vessel was an amphora. These have been adopted already from ancient Greeks and could hold 24 liters of content. This wasn't limited to wine and olive oil, but could also be used to store, for example, garum, a special fish sauce, or fruits. Depending on what contents they were made for, the amphorae had small differences among them. As for ceramic cups that were meant for drinking, these were often made with an attempt to copy the colors of glass or metallic cups, which were more expensive. Meanwhile, glassblowing simplified and increased glass production, making it a general commodity. Imported colorful vessels were most popular at the earlier stages, while glass with natural light green and blue hue prevailed in the later years. At the same time, oil lamps would be used as the most common source of artificial light, and though practical, this could be a work of art as well. Same can be applied to rings, particularly the signet rings, which were set with a gem, a piece of precious or semi-precious stone or glass, bearing a symbolic image that would identify its wearer, especially when pressed into wax. According to ancient Roman authors, they even had magical powers, most often protecting the wearer and his family. When sitting at a table for a meal, the Romans used big and small spoons as well as utensils similar to today's toothpicks. The knives were mostly used when preparing food, while forks weren't yet used in Europe. The main ingredients of Roman cuisine were cereals like wheat, barley, oats, rye, and millet that were used for porridge and bread. Along those, people also consumed fruits and vegetables, dairy and dairy products, honey, eggs, and Mediterranean goods like grinded herbs, olives, fish, and wine. Meat, however, was most often reserved for well-off families, except on feast days, when even ordinary Romans treated themselves to better food. The Romans had 4 meals. For breakfast they only had bread and fruit, for snack or brunch as well as lunch they usually had cold dishes prepared with fish, eggs, or vegetables. They enjoyed wine mixed with water and other additives, while beer and unmixed wine was considered a beverage for barbarians. Pliny attributed the venerable age of 87 years of Empress Livia, wife of Augustus, to a quality wine from the Karst region. The last and the main meal of the day was dinner, which also served as a social event. Even in provinces, Romans took care of their personal hygiene. In cities they took a thermal bath, private or public, and if available, a gym. For the rich, this was an everyday activity where they could also conduct business and discuss politics. The parts meant for women were strictly separated from men's. For less wealthy and those without close access to baths, a river would do. The use of cosmetics was widespread between both sexes. Romans were aesthetes and pursued beauty in themselves and in their surroundings. At the countryside, the Romans increased farmland with deforestation, draining of swamps, and regulation of rivers. The Romans used local knowledge to locate and extract nearby resources and develop industries like ironworks and stonemasonry. A very popular source of entertainment were gladiatorial games and theater performances, as well as dice, board games, and tactical games. Children played with intricate made dolls and toys. Every town regarding itself important had its own theater. Their comedies and tragedies, the former more popular than the latter, were performed along with the accompanying dances and musical scores. Music had an important place in the everyday life of Romans. It was a necessary part of both public and private religious rituals and ceremonies. One of the most popular instruments was tibia, while lyre was more prominent mostly among the educated and upper classes. Different instruments were characteristically used for different deities. For example, in honor of Cybele, musicians performed with instruments like hand drum and cymbals. However, few ancient deities were more associated with music than Bacchus. In temples and holy sites, professional musicians played, who then also offered their services for public and private clientele. Their brotherhoods spread even across multiple provinces. Music was also an important part of the Roman military, as every legion contained multiple musicians. Their original task was intimidation of opponents, as well as giving signals to engage in different battle maneuvers. People learned and practiced both lyrical and instrumental music in private. At first this was a domain of women, but after the rise of the empire, musical education spread to both sexes, especially among well-off citizens. With the spread of Christianity, songs became more and more ecclesiastical in nature and an important part of the religious ceremonies. But with the arrival of Christianity, most dice games and similar activities, once popular, were then forbidden. Like before in prehistory, there was a high mortality rate of children who were buried through inhumation, while adults were often cremated, their ashes closed within a ceramic or glass urn, and together with the deceased's personal items and offerings for the afterlife were enclosed into the grave. This gradually changed though, and towards the end of the 3rd century, adults too were in majority buried, along with fewer items. Romans were buried outside settlements along the roads leading into them, usually divided into individual burial plots. The closer to the road and the city gates they were buried, the higher status of the deceased. Many had monuments built before their death or a member of their family. Monuments were a physical expression of how a deceased wanted to be remembered and would often be their most important legacy. For common people, tombstones with portraits were the biggest if not the only self-representation in public they could achieve. The status of a deceased was revealed by art, relief, inscription, size, and other characteristic of a monument. But not all could afford monuments, altars, or even portrait tombstones. One more modest variation was to use the lower part of an amphora and place it upside down on the grave. It is important to note though, as the Roman Empire was a vast state including peoples of many different beliefs and origins, so too did the funerary rites and beliefs surrounding death and afterlife differ between regions. Such is an example of special cinerary containers that symbolize houses or huts, so-called house urns. In the late Empire, Christianity became the official religion and Emperor Theodosius ultimately forbid cremation. But the empire was more and more settled with new arrivals, like Goths, and with the burials remained pretty diverse throughout and after the Roman period. While most people of the Roman Empire would never see the ruler or the city of Rome, he could hardly be ignored. The omnipresent emperor was the supreme military commander, leading priest, judge, and administrator. He and his family were depicted on coins, forums, triumphal arches, theaters, public fountains, and mentioned in imperial inscriptions. Their deeds were promoted by the town criers along with news. The cities and milestones between them were carved with his name, as were temples, statues, and altars. The ritualistic worship of the emperor, the imperial cult, was an important part of the state ideology since the first emperor Augustus, who descended title the Divine, as did most of his successors after him. At the edges of Italy and in the provinces, practicing the imperial cult was a demonstration of loyalty to Rome. Manners and usage of the emperor and imperial family set an example for their people to follow. But fashion was diverse, with people developing their own regional variations, especially the upper classes. The Romans also brought literacy as well as the Latin language, while Greek remained most common in the eastern part of the empire. In many places, written examples already exist before the arrival of Romans, but these are limited to limited phrases and words like names. The process of language assimilation was a lengthy one, with people continuing to use pre-Roman alphabets and names even into the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. The most famous Roman implement for writing were wax tablets and stylus. These allowed for the written text to be erased and to reuse the empty space. They also wrote on wood, parchment, and papyrus scrolls with ink and quills. The Romans were not limited by writing what we would now consider capital letters, which were commonly found on imperial inscriptions. For daily correspondence, the Romans also used their so-called cursive text. The indigenous people subjugated by Romans worshipped their own gods before their arrival. Such was the case with the Celts, who were highly superstitious. Details about their worship and religions are, however, mostly lost to us. Those that are not are passed on by Roman authors who, despite providing valuable insight, were plagued by bias, limited and indirect information, as well as Romanizing Celtic deities. In general, Celtic religion revolved around magical entities pervading nature and objects alike, while influencing every individual and determining their destinies. Celtic gods and rituals lost their power with the declining Celtic population. Only in the farthest fringes of Western Europe did their languages and beliefs persist to this day. While the Romans brought their own deities with them along with their conquest, the barbaric pantheons were eventually identified with the Roman ones, connected or equalized with names like Jupiter, Mercury, Victoria, and Nemesis. With the spread of the Roman Empire and its incorporation of people across the Mediterranean and beyond, so too did foreign cults and religions found their way into the heart of the empire. Such was the case of Mithraism, which originated in Persia, as well as, at the end of the day, Christianity. Romans too were highly superstitious, and performing religious ceremonies and rites was a part of everyday life. Votive offerings were especially common, ranging from inscribed altars to small objects like symbols in the form of pendants and other apparel, which were worn by Romans to display their devotion and to attract divine favor and protection. Statues, both big and small, decorated Roman houses, and different religious imagery sculpted into glass and ceramic vessels. Not all deities were praised in lavish temples of marble. Across Europe, many sanctums were found within caves, where archaeologists have found traces of votive offerings and rituals. These weren't temporary sanctuaries though, as they could operate for centuries. After the great prosperity and development, the so-called Pax Romana followed the unstable period characterized by civil wars and foreign incursions. Individual emperors managed to keep it under control, most prominent among them Aurelian, Diocletian, and Constantine. Through different reforms and action, they restored the state and introduced stronger military organization and centralized government. Having said that, it's become impossible to rule such a vast space from a single center of power, and the empire eventually introduced dual rulership between the eastern and western parts of the empire, both of which gradually grew apart. The incursions of the barbarians continued, and in 378, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Visigoths dealt a crippling blow to the Roman army. For the first time in history, the Romans lost control over the invading barbaric immigrants. The city of Rome itself also began to lose significance. Capital functions were moved to other cities closer to the borders and communication lines like Mediolanum and Constantinople. Christianity replaced traditional Roman deities, and bishops gradually took on roles similar to state officials. Only remote and hard-to-reach sanctuaries remained. Christianity grew more and more in prominence as the barbaric incursions stretched into the empire and the Roman state deteriorated. With the Battle of Frigidus in 394, the final nail in the coffin of the old Roman pagan worship was hammered. But as life in towns and on plains became more and more dangerous, people began moving to more and more remote and less accessible locations. What they couldn't take with them, they buried or hid behind, some never to uncover until present day, leaving precious time capsules for the archaeologists. Ultimately, the Pax Romana, the Golden Age of Rome, would end by impending civil wars, barbarian incursions, and economic decline. The more or less same reasons that brought the end to the Roman Empire. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire and during the barbaric migrations, the Roman way of life slowly disappeared. Its knowledge, culture, and customs were replaced or absorbed by new peoples. One consistency that would remain in place of the former Roman state was the Catholic Church, which would be the largest semblance of order in the world moving into the dark ages of the medieval period in Europe. But if barbaric invasions finished off the Roman Empire, it could also be said that they had jump-started its expansion. Check out the next video about the Battle of Aria and its aftermath to learn more about how and why Rome rose from a small town into a great empire. Be sure to like, subscribe, you know how YouTube works, and I'll bring you more history soon.